Hi, and welcome to Making Your Colorwork Pop. Have you ever spent time knitting a gorgeous colorwork pattern only to find that your finished project falls flat or the motifs don't pop the way you expected? I'm Kerry Bullock Ozkan, and today I'll be sharing my top tips for a successful colorwork project. You'll learn everything you need to know to feel confident in your next project. Here's what I'll be covering in this presentation. First, I'll tell you the single most important thing you may be missing in choosing colors for color work, and why seemingly vibrant color combinations may not work in practice. Here's a hint. It's probably not that you're bad at choosing colors. I believe that most of us gravitate instinctively toward pleasing color combinations. I'll give you some tips for choosing colors for projects with 3, 4, or even more colors. Finally, we'll talk about what you need to know about color dominance to make sure your motifs pop when you're knitting them. We're going to be focused on stranded color work, but most of these tips also apply to knitting stripes, mosaic, or slip stitch color work, as well as double knitting. Before we go further, feel free to pause the recording and grab a few yarns from your stash to try out these concepts for yourself. Before we get started, here's a little bit about me. I love designing stranded color work. In fact, one of my very first published patterns featured stranded color work. I've been knitting for almost 2 decades, and I've been designing knitting patterns since around 2016. I've also been a tech editor since 2018, and I've taught workshops and written articles in multiple publications. I'm also a spinner and sometimes weaver and natural dyer. I love to work with wool and have a special passion for breed-specific yarns and fibers, which inspire my knitting designs. You can find more tips and techniques on my blog at bullockoscandesigns.com. So, what is the most important thing when it comes to choosing colors for color work? The most important factor is value. Value is defined simply as how light or dark a color is. The image at the bottom left on this slide is a value scale, which shows the range of values from dark to light and can be used to determine the color's value. In the photo on the right, you'll see several yarns that have differing values. If I were to show you the color version of this picture, these would all be shades of blue. But as you can see, they all have different values when compared with the value scale, from almost the lightest shade to near the darkest end of the spectrum. Why does value matter? You may be choosing colors that appear very different, and yet when you put them side by side, the motifs you worked so hard to knit might not appear distinct. When we knit color work, we want to consider the relative value of the colors we're working with. This is also known as the value contrast. These two photos show a perfect example. The photo at the left shows two colors, a blue and a red, that appear to be very different. But when viewed in grayscale, they're actually very similar in value. So if you use these colors next to each other, they might appear muted or muddy, or your motifs may not show up at all. The two yarns in the photo on the right, on the other hand, have a very different value. So these would show very well when used in a colorwork motif. So how can you check your contrast? My favorite method is to use my smartphone camera. I take a photo of the yarns and then I convert that photo to grayscale and compare it to the value scale. Your phone may have a grayscale filter, or you can use the edit mode to reduce the saturation to 0. If you're shopping online, you can take a screenshot and use a simple photo editor to do the same thing. Feel free to pause the recording here, grab a couple of yarns from your stash, and try this out for yourself. Here's what this looks like on my Android phone. First, I open up the editing features on my phone, usually indicated by a pencil icon. On the left, I've opened the filters and used one of the black and white filters to convert the image to grayscale. You'll see that on my phone, there are 2 different grayscale filters, but they're both very similar for the purposes that we need them here. To use the saturation setting, I open the editing features again and tap on the little sun in the middle at the bottom of the screen. I then slide over to the circle above it that says saturation. You can then slide the saturation to 0, or on my phone, that is indicated as a negative 100%. Another option, if you don't have a phone camera handy, is to take a strand of each yarn and try twisting them together. As you can see in the photo at the left, the green and gray combination here is pretty low contrast. Even though that's a fairly bright green, you would think that it would contrast quite nicely with the gray. But when you twist them together, you can't really see the difference from a distance. The burgundy and gray, on the other hand, have quite a high value contrast, and you can see the distinction between the colors very clearly next to each other, even at a distance. Now, let's talk about how to apply this to choosing colors for a project. One simple way to choose colors that I use frequently is to choose a color that I want to use and then add a neutral color or a color with a high value contrast. Many Scandinavian colorwork designs use only two high contrast colors, such as black and white. Norwegian Selbu mittens are a good example of this. For a third color, you can add another color that's similar in value to one of your first two. You don't have to use very high contrast colors. You only need enough contrast for the colors to appear distinct when they're next to each other. Let's take a look at an example of this in practice. Here are two samples that I knit for my s'mores cowl pattern. On the left is the original sample for the pattern. I knew I wanted to use burgundy and navy together in a design, so I started with those two colors. Now, I know both of these have a pretty dark value, and so I knew I needed to add a lighter color for contrast. I chose to add a lighter neutral gray to work my motifs in. As an aside, this cowl demonstrates how you can use just a single motif and only a few colors to achieve visual variety. I started with first the navy blue as my background and gray as my motif color, then changed the background to burgundy for the second repeat, keeping the same color for the motif. Finally, I flipped the background and motif using the gray as the background color and the blue for the motif. This creates visual interest with a minimum of colors. Of course, you don't have to stick with neutral colors. You can create a palette using all bright colors too, if you're careful about the contrast. Let's look at the version on the right. Again, I chose two darker value colors, the teal and the orange. The yellow is lighter in value, so it pops nicely even against the colorful background. In this case, I started with the teal. I knew I wanted to use that. And then I chose the yellow and the orange after that to give me contrast and another color variety. Here's a quick tip. If you still don't feel confident choosing colors that go together, if you are choosing different colorways from the same yarn line, they most likely will go together because most yarn makers will have designed their palette with that in mind. Now let's talk about how to choose colors for a pattern that uses more than 3 colors. Try starting with 2 or 3 colors first and then add additional shades of one of those colors. You can add an almost unlimited number of colors this way. Classic Fair Isle designs can use up to 13 colors or more. Here are 2 examples of my Rione egg cowl, which uses 4 colors. For the sample on the left, I started with a 3-color palette of warm gray, rust orange, and light blue. I knew I needed to add a bit more contrast once again, so in this case, I added the dark brown. This is a similar color value to the orange, but because it's a dark brown and not a brighter, because the orange is brighter, it looks like it's a little bit darker. And since the brown is a warmer brown, to me, it acts as sort of a darker shade of the orange that creates a color harmony between the two. This method is illustrated even more clearly in the second example, or the one on the right. This time, I started with dark blue, a cooler light gray, and yellow. I then added the same lighter shade of blue from the first cowl for additional shading. The light blue has a similar value to the gray, so I can easily alternate between the two as my background. You'll notice that Fair Isle patterns will use several shades of similar colors or closely adjacent colors to achieve subtle gradations that Fair Isle is known for. One other note here. The yellow in the cowl at right actually has a pretty light value, and if you were to look at the cowl in grayscale, you would see that it almost disappears against the gray background. Certain very saturated colors will appear bright against a background, even though they're the same value as the background. Fun fact, this is known as the Helmholtz-Kohlrausch effect. You may have noticed that in the last slide, the yellow or orange only appears in a few rows in the center of each motif. Here is one of my earlier swatches for the Rioneg cowl. As you can see, the color work appears muddy and the motifs don't show very clearly. It looks very stripy. The problem here is one of proportion. There is too much orange. It adds more interest when you use the colors in different proportions, and using just a bit of a brighter color like the orange or yellow really makes the motifs pop, especially if you use them in the center. Fair Isle knitters often refer to this as adding a bit of poison. Often they will add a little bit of a color that the knitter might see as ugly or too bright for the rest of the palette to really pop the motifs. This is a great reason to swatch, by the way. It gives you a chance to test out different ways of using your color palette. Let's do a more real-time example, such as we can do on a recording. Here are some colors I've pulled out of my stash that I think would make a nice palette. I've chosen a light gray, several shades of blue, and one brighter color with the red. Will this palette work? Well, if I look at these in grayscale, I can see that the lightest blue is similar in value to the gray, and the two other blues are also similar to each other in value, as well as the red being similar. To use these in a colorwork project, I would probably choose the two light colors as my background and use the dark blues with just a little bit of the red as my motif colors. I could also choose to use the darker colors as the background and the lighter colors for the motifs. Or, as I did in the Rioneg cowl in the previous slide, you could even alternate dark motifs with light ones. That's up to personal preference. The key here is that I'm choosing either light or dark as my background. Okay, so you've chosen your color palette and you're ready to knit. There's one more thing you need to know. How you hold the yarn in your hands affects how the colors will appear. This is the concept of color dominance or yarn dominance. If you're a knitter who knits colorwork two-handed, as I do, the color you hold in your left hand will appear larger. So you want to make sure that you hold your motif color in your left hand consistently. If you hold your colors in one hand, the color that is lowest in your hand will appear dominant. This is because the yarn that is lower will travel a slightly longer path around the needle, and thus the stitches of that yarn will be ever so slightly larger. You can see this in the swatch at the right. The small border motif at the bottom was knit with the yarn in the right hand, and the gray stitches appear smaller. In the same motif at the top, the gray yarn was held in my left hand, so the gray stitches appear larger and more forward. I hope this presentation has made you feel confident in picking colors for your next colorwork project. If you'd like to get started right away, click the link below at the presentation or scan the QR code on the screen to grab a free download with tips from today's presentation. This includes a blank chart for the s'mores cowl to plan your color palette. In the download, you'll also find a coupon for 50% off the s'mores cowl pattern. If you've purchased the Expedition Pass, you will receive not only the s'mores cowl, but 2 other patterns from my Stranded Colorwork bundle to start you on your colorwork journey for free. And don't forget to post your questions in the discussion thread for this presentation. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.